All right, we left off with the colonial taxation and protests. Is this cool? Did anybody have any questions or any review there? Yeah, what's up? We did not. We did not. We attended an assembly. All right, which you guys did a fantastic job there. I was very proud of you. All right. So what we're looking at, delegation to bloodshed here, as a result, a direct result of the events of the Boston Tea Party, England shuts down the Boston Harbor. They shut down town meetings. They they do more than curb. They revoke the charter. And what do they have to do in response? What needs to be done in response? Let's pay attention here. All that is enforced through the coercive acts. That's what the British called them. The intolerable acts are what the colonists called them. What do the colonies have to do? What do the people of Boston have to do to get back those rights? They have to pay for the tea. Very good. They got to pay for the property they destroyed. So in response to this is a unifying moment. Other colonies decide to send supply because Boston Harbor has been shut down. One colony in particular is Virginia. They decide to send food, have a day of prayer and fasting, and with that, the colonial governor of Virginia, Lord John Murray Dunmore, shuts down and disbands the House of Burgesses. All right? And other colonial governments, legislatures, have a similar scenario occur where they're trying to support the Bostonians and it doesn't work out. Their legislatures are going to be suspended as well. I don't know if you realize this, but Ben Franklin also was brought to trial by the Privy Council. And in response to this, these little grievances add up to make all of the colonies, with the exception of one, send delegates to Philadelphia to meet in the fall of 1774. And that group is known as the First Continental Congress. Every colony meets with the exception of Georgia. Do keep in mind that Georgia is quite loyal. They are the last colony established in 1733, and they are a royal colony, right? So they've got some pretty solid ties to England. Georgia will be coaxed into the revolution, but there's a deep division in Georgia, even throughout the American Revolution, of loyalists and patriots. Hey, sorry. No, you're fine. What's that? Yeah, for sure. Over here. All right. So what we're looking what we're looking at here is not a legit meeting for independence, but a step toward revolution. They are going to lay out their grievances, their problems. You get people in this convention starting to say, "I'm an American." Guys like Patrick Henry. You also have a list of Declaration of Rights that is going to be established. But I want to be really, really clear with you guys. This is not the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, that's not going to be drafted until the spring, late spring, early summer of 1776. So we'll get to that here shortly. All right. Another thing that the First Continental Congress does is it gets everybody thinking, you know what, we need to create our own state conventions and decide where we're going to go. So now we're moving from colony to state. that discussion. Now, it's not a formal thing, but it's a movement in that direction. So the colonies are going to have their own colonial conventions, and those colonial conventions, for example, in Virginia, are going to lead to discussions like, hey, maybe we should raise a militia to defend what? Ourselves. Yeah, defend ourselves, defend our arsenals. Have you ever heard of an arsenal called a magazine before? That's what they called them in the colonial period. In fact, in March of 1775, the very famous Liberty or Death speech given by Patrick Henry of St. John's Church in Churchill, that was given because Patrick Henry wanted to raise a militia. And the vote passes, and he does in fact lead a militia known as the Hanover Regulars. And it's kind of crazy too to think about, within hours of the events of Lexington and Concord, the very same thing was happening in Virginia. Patrick Henry was leading a militia force to Williamsburg to take and protect the arsenal or the magazine at Williamsburg. How many of you guys have visited Williamsburg? Probably nearly all of us, right? And if you've gone down there, they probably said, hey, do you want to pretend to be a soldier? And you're like, sure, let me take that little wooden musket and march around, okay? That, you did that right in front of the magazine. That's where Patrick Henry wanted to get, but he showed up. He and his men didn't get there in time. The hated governor of Virginia, Lord John Murray Dunmore, and British Marines had already emptied out the arsenal. So this is kind of an interesting moment in American history, or an interesting moment in Virginia history, period. Patrick Henry and his group of militia would have been a little bit earlier to the party. We might be talking about the first shots of the Revolution being fired in Virginia and not in Massachusetts. But the early morning and the events of Lexington and Concord, not only did in the timeline of the Revolution did they beat Patrick Henry and the British to the arsenal, but the events unfolded obviously earlier. So that's where I basically wanted to go next. Did you guys have any questions about the Virginia Convention or the raising of a militia force here? All right, so another important thing that I want to point out too is that when we talk about the Virginia Convention, this is the foundation of moving Virginia's government from Williamsburg to Richmond. Richmond was a town of trade and agriculture, but there's no canal system yet, right? And there are pigs and chickens and livestock roaming the streets. It was a very tiny little town. That legislature, that new Virginia Convention, that former House of Burgesses that become the General Assembly, helped Richmond get put on the map, so to speak. All right, so as we move forward, we will talk about the sons and daughters of liberty in the city of Boston. All right. Outside of Boston, militia force known as the Minutemen has started to train and drill and prepare for battle. And in that preparation for battle, the British do not want them to have arms to potentially fight against soldiers who are stationed in Boston as a result of the Quartering Act. But through the committees of correspondence, which we've already learned about, the Sons of Liberty have received information that the British are planning to send a detachment of 700 soldiers under the leadership of Colonel Francis Smith to take the ammunition, cannon, and muskets from their arsenal in Concord. Furthermore, they're also being dispatched to capture Sam Adams, John Adams, and John Hancock. Why? Why those three individuals? Yeah, well, they're going to be. Good job. Well done. They are part of the revolutionary cause. They're leading patriots, right? We've got the main the main leader of the Sons of Liberty in Sam Adams. We have John Adams, who's a leading delegate in the Continental Congress, and we have John Hancock, who's bankrolling the revolutionary cause. What's that? And a heck of a good smuggler. That's a good part of it. So there's going to be a code that's going to be determined by the local Sons of Liberty, and that is in the Old North Church in Boston. If the British are going to march by land, they're going to hang one lantern. If they're going to come by boat through the harbor and up the Charles River, they're going to hang two lanterns. So oneth by land, twoeth by sea. And they loaded boats. They're making their way up the Charles River. Two lanterns are hung up, and Sons and Daughters of Liberty begin to ride. Paul Revere, William Dawes, Sybil Ludington, and a number of others are going to go out and ride in and around Boston to let folks know that they need to take up arms. They probably didn't say the British are coming. Why? They're British subjects. They probably just said the regulars are coming, or maybe the redcoats, or maybe the lobster backs. But they probably just said the regulars are coming. Okay? Let me close this out real quick before we move on. All right. So the shot heard around the world. Soldiers are going to unload, sorry about that, near Lexington to march on Concord. And what they're not aware of is that the arsenal in Concord has already been unloaded. They're also unaware that John and Sam Adams, cousins, and John Hancock are in hiding. So their entire mission is going to be foiled when they arrive at Concord. Before they arrive at Concord, they get to Lexington, and they are met by a ragtag group of militiamen, the Massachusetts Minutemen, who have taken up arms and are waiting for them in the town. We're not quite sure who did it. It's definitely somebody on the side of the Patriots. Fires a volley into the British front lines. Return. We'll get into spies later. Return volley into the militiamen, the Minutemen, and the British then do what? Then requires them to retreat. Requires the Minutemen to retreat. This is a maneuver that is pretty intimidating on the field of battle, especially when you're vastly outnumbered and fighting one of the most well-trained armies in the world. It's called fixed what? This movement is called fixed bayonets. So they're going to fix bayonets, and they are going to begin to march toward the Minutemen. Minutemen will break ranks. They will retreat. Again, they're vastly outnumbered. Well, what they'll end up doing is they're going to alert the townspeople between Lexington and Concord that the British are on the march. So the first engagement is not a battle. The shot heard around the world, obviously, is a figure of speech. It was not heard around the world. It was just the early shot fired. But there's no turning back now. This tiny little skirmish, small little battle, it's not the first fixed battle. It's just the first skirmish, the first shots of the war, kicks this war off at Lexington. So on the left here, we have Patrick Henry's Liberty or Death speech. On the right, Paul Revere's Ride. And here we have, closest to us, the Massachusetts Minutemen. And in the distance, the British Army in the town of Lexington. You guys have any questions? Sure. Got a little handy-dandy map for you here. You can see Sons of Liberty movements in blue, British movements in red, The first engagement on Lexington Green, you know what green means there? Yeah, you're on the right track. It's a commons area. It's where people, brought their animals to graze, soldiers trained, people picnicked and played. It's kind of like it's kind of like a park. Good job. And then we have Concord. On the return march from Concord, after they find out that the arsenal's empty and they still haven't apprehended Adams, or Hancock, on the march back, more Minutemen have gathered arms, and they are going to initiate guerrilla-style warfare, firing upon the British from behind trees, from houses, barns, taking cover. The British were not prepared for that style of warfare, and they really weren't prepared they were prepared, but they weren't anticipating any major military engagement from April 19th from the wee hours of the morning, about 4:30 in the morning of April 19th to the end of the day. Do keep in mind, we're all familiar with the Boston Marathon, right? The marathon begins not far outside of Concord and is run in and around Boston and finishes in Boston. It is held on Patriots' Day. It's held on April 19th for that reason. All right, questions about Lexington and Concord? The first major fixed battle that we're going to talk about is Bunker Hill. Ironically enough, fought on Breed's Hill. We'll get into that in lesson 6. All right, so let's take a look at some British strengths and weaknesses. When the war broke out, England had a very heavy population, 7.5 million people to America's 2 million, superior military, one of the strongest standing armies in the world, strongest navy in the world, great wealth, and what they also have the capacity to do that the Americans don't have is industrial production. They can mass-produce weapons, mass-produce bullets, mass-produce ammunition, mass-produce everything they need, where the Americans they have a lot of available natural resources, but they don't really have the capability of mass production. It has to be what we would call piecemeal. They also had some 30,000 Hessians. These are German mercenaries, soldiers for hire at the start of the war. These were hired by George III in Parliament. They have a professional army of about 50,000 men. They have about 50,000 American loyalists, and they have Native American tribes that are going to side with them. Now, one thing about the Hessians, that early strength will evolve into a weakness. Why might that be a weakness later on for British? Exactly. They're being paid, right? They're not fighting necessarily for an ideology. Another problem that the British are going to face with the Hessians is desertion. Oh, you know what? My contract's up, or my contract's near up. I'm good. And then they're going to sort of be absorbed into the colonies. Keep in mind, the British are spread out. They're not just focusing on America. They've got conflicts in Ireland. They've got conflicts in North Africa. They've got conflicts in India going on around this time. Another issue that we need to talk about is the French. The French are going to be a thorn in the side for the British throughout this war. At first, it's going to be undercover and in secret. But by 1778, it's going to be a true alliance. So that's going to be a weakness that they're going to face. Another problem they're going to face is the Whigs. The common Whigs, as the war moves on, they don't want to kill their American cousins, but also they don't want to pay for this war. This is something that I want to talk about in a second. Another thing that I want to talk about is the fact that a lot of the British generals that are sent over, they are going to underestimate the military forces and the military leaders that they're facing on the field. They're also not really that familiar with the guerrilla-style warfare tactics that a lot of these American colonists are going to inflict upon them, especially the sharpshooters. A lot of the frontier units that were sharpshooter units, they had no code of ethics on the battlefield. They took high ground positions, they picked off Native American guides, they picked off soldiers, they picked off officers, they used any tactic they could to defeat the British in battle. As the war moves on, disease is a big problem. A lot of smallpox outbreaks on both sides, on the British side and the American side. There's another problem that occurs as well, and that is the lack of supply. Soldiers, especially British soldiers in rural areas, are going to face a big problem with malnutrition and not having enough to eat, and that creates not just problems for fighting, but it also causes problems for morale. The other thing I want to talk about too, besides provisions, is this war, and this is a really good little term to remember, it's not only expensive, but it's expansive. It is fought as far north as New England and the St. Lawrence Seaway in Canada, and as far south as the border of the Carolinas and Georgia. At sea, it is fought in the Caribbean, it is fought in the Chesapeake Bay, and it is fought off the coast of Ireland and England. And the American Navy was tiny. But by the end of the war, 90% of the American Navy was the French Navy. The French naval forces and French military supply are what truly turned the tide of war. Without the French, America is not going to win this thing. There's a German Hessian. Soldier for hire. Questions about British strengths and weaknesses. Let's talk about some American disadvantages, some weaknesses that America faced. All right? Lack of unity, not a lot of soldiers. Money is a huge problem. They don't have it. Supply is a huge problem because they can't produce it. Colonial legislatures had been suspended, i.e. the House of Burgesses, by Lord John Murray Dunmore. About a third of the population were patriots, making the other 2/3 either neutral, privateer, or loyalists to Britain. We call them loyalist Tories. A lot of jealousy within the ranks of the Continental Congress, a lot of jealousy from colony to colony, a lot of jealousy within the military ranks because they didn't agree with all of the appointments. A lot of these appointments are political because not everybody has military experience going into this war. Obviously, those who had military experience from the French and Indian War were sought after. Inflation was a really big problem monetarily during the war. Continental money was pretty much worthless throughout and after the war. We'll talk about currency issues later. A lack of military training for the first couple of years of the war. What really turns the tide is the training of soldiers at Valley Forge. It was a brutal winter. We'll talk about that in lesson 6. A great deal of disease and starvation, smallpox outbreak, but the winter of 1778, the smallpox inoculation helps turn the tide. Really nothing, little of a navy, led by John Paul Jones, but most of it was the dependence upon the French Navy. Here's Lord John Murray Dunmore, the last colonial governor of Virginia. This is another American disadvantage too. John Murray Dunmore is going to issue a proclamation allowing for the freedom of any slave that will take up arms against Virginia and join the British Army. This is going to lead to the emancipation and freedom of a lot of slaves in colonial Virginia as a result of Dunmore's proclamation. And then we'll wrap things up. Any questions about the American disadvantages before we move forward? So some American advantages: strong leadership, militarily by Washington, politically by Jefferson, former member of the House of Burgesses, now a leading delegate in the Second Continental Congress for Virginia. chosen to be the main author of the Declaration. Ben Franklin, smooth diplomat, American minister to France, single-handedly brokers the deal with France for the Treaty of Alliance, 1778, where France will provide America with guns, supplies, gunpowder, and naval forces. Marquis de Lafayette, at the age of 19, will come over and serve as Washington's military aide-de-camp. He'll rise through the ranks very quickly, gaining his own command. Prussian drill master, former aide-de-camp to Frederick the Great, Baron von Steuben, is brought over. He is going to develop the American manual drill, and he's going to whip our soldiers into shape at Valley Forge. Continental Army is going to fight using guerrilla-style warfare. The Continental Army knew the terrain better than the British, and they exploited that intelligence. Quinn brought up spy rings earlier. Espionage is going to be a huge factor in this war on the side of the Americans. Sharpshooters are going to be a major advantage. There's going to be an Austrian and German style hunting rifle that is going to allow American riflemen and sharpshooters to hit their targets for up to 200 yards away. That's going to help turn the tide in battles like Saratoga. Saratoga is bigger than a battle. It's like a full-on siege. And then the last part here, Americans are fighting for moral advantage, ideology of independence. That is going to be significant throughout the entire war. Hey. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna go. It said like Native American scouts were British. Why?
Because there were tribes that had to make a choice. Were they going to fight on the British side or the American side? Because at the end of it, if they were on the right side, it was going to work out in their favor. What we're going to learn is it's not. They're, damned if you do, damned if you don't type of scenario, That's a really good question. One tribe in particular that's deeply divided by this war are going to be the Iroquois. Here we have Lafayette on the left, Baron von Steuben on the right. Any questions before we wrap up? Beautiful. Good job today, guys.